A quarter century after Islamists blew up the Twin Towers, an Islamist reigned supreme in New York City. We spent trillions in the war on terror, only to end up with allies of terror in the halls of Congress and America's biggest city. What happens next will determine whether the Christian West dies or returns to greatness. I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight. My guest today is Robert Spencer, an expert on Islamic terrorism, director of Jihad Watch, and a prolific author out with a new book, Intifada on the Hudson, The Selling of Zohran Mamdani. Robert, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks, Hayden.
I want to start with Zohran Mamdani himself. What a complicated figure this guy is. Ethnically Indian, born in Uganda, raised in the Bronx, fluent in 7 languages, principally Marxism, and a blend of hardline Islam and socialism, but not just any socialism, the Soviet form prevalent in the Third World throughout the Cold War, the kind that's deeply anti-colonial and sees the Marxist struggle in racialist terms, not so much class terms. I think this is something different from the old American left. So, Robert, help us understand what sets Mamdani apart from your typical leftists, say, like Andrew Cuomo or Nancy Pelosi.
Well, you're absolutely right, Hayden. He does represent something completely new in American politics. And primarily, it's the fact that it's not American. As you noted, he represents a kind of third world anti-colonialism that ultimately originated among European thinkers, but is now, as you stated, something that we find more in the third world than in the West. And it fits the poverty of the third world and the lack of progress there into the Marxist framework of oppressor and oppressed, sees everything through that prism. And so Zohran Mamdani has come here to throw off the chains of that oppressor and to enable the oppressed to breathe free. That has many congruences with Western Marxism, but is not exactly identical because, as you pointed out, there's a marked racial component to what Mamdani is doing. He actually even said and refused to retract or apologize for saying that he was going to tax white neighborhoods in New York more heavily than others. He added by way of explanation that he meant only that he was going to deal with the more affluent neighborhoods in this way, but it's clear that he sees the world as a great struggle between the white oppressor and the brown oppressed. And he represents the brown oppressed coming to power in the greatest city of the white oppressor.
There's a really eerie parallel with Barack Obama. And actually, I've heard people on the left say Mamdani is the guy that conservative Tea Party types always said Obama was. Obviously, they're speaking sympathetic to all of that. But the whole concept of promoting dreams from my father is a fascinating parallel between these two, well, frankly, kind of Islamic imports from Africa, aren't they? So let's talk about Mahmoud Mamdani. As you know, he dedicated his book about smashing Western colonialism to his young son, Zohran. And I think a lot of Zohran's worldview is filtered through his father's very anti-colonial, Soviet-tinged legacy. So walk us through the history there and how you see it and what that's done to affect this young man's worldview.
It's kind of ironic, Hayden, because Mahmoud Mamdani actually became a Marxist while he was enjoying the generosity of the United States government. As a young exchange student from Uganda in the early 60s, he won a scholarship that was offered to third world students and came to the United States, where he got involved in the civil rights movement, and he says that that was his introduction to the Marxism that he's quite clearly passed on in a very skillful manner, because Zohran Mamdani seems to be a true believer to his son. And so what we are dealing with is a peculiar kind of anti-colonialist Marxism that, as I noted, racializes the whole conflict, which is red meat for the left today, which tends to see everything in racial terms. And Obama did start a great deal of that when racial tensions were at one of their lowest points in American history. Obama stirred them up again. And Zohran Mamdani represents, in a certain sense, the franchising of the Obama idea, the treatment of Barack Obama as a template, so that now you have not only Mamdani, but Omar Fateh in Minneapolis and others elsewhere who are non-Western, non-American, non-white, non-Christian candidates who are open socialists and represent this kind of third world Marxism.
And my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but Mahmoud Mamdani was a kind of Pan-African nationalist, right? Or at least a Ugandan nationalist. He's not ethnically black. But ironically, it was Idi Amin who kicked him out because he's not black, because he's not Ugandan. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Mahmoud Mamdani was expelled from Uganda along with other Indian residents of the country because they were not native Ugandans by Idi Amin. He later returned, and it was during that period after he had returned that Zohran was born. And ultimately, Mahmoud Mamdani wrote about Idi Amin and the expulsion of the Indians in a positive manner, as is consistent with his worldview, because he sees everything in, you see what I mean? He sees everything in terms of this racialized Marxism that we've been discussing. And that's exactly what Idi Amin was embodying in kicking out the non-Ugandan, non-black oppressor for supposedly in service of safeguarding the rights of the native Ugandans. Mahmoud Mamdani had to get behind that in order to be consistent in his worldview. And so he embraced the very individual who was responsible for his expulsion from his native country.
Well, points for consistency there. But, I think a lot of Americans will find the idea of a large Indian minority in Uganda very strange. But of course, this actually is a legacy of genuine colonialism. The Indian imported labor from the British Empire to various African parts of the British Empire and Great Britain itself here that persisted all the way through much of the 19th and 20th centuries here. But what's interesting to me is the very visceral hatred of British colonialism and British imperialism being cast on the United States. And my understanding is a lot of them, like Mahmoud, would see it as, well, the United States is the successor state to British imperialism. We just have a different, maybe even more malicious form of that's persisted after World War II into the 21st century now. Am I simplifying that, or am I close to the mark?
No, I think you're 100% on the money, Hayden. The thing is that the third world Marxists like Mahmoud Mamdani speak about economic colonialism, that the United States is an economic empire that has colonized much of the world by means of dominating their markets, not by means in the earlier fashion of the British of a political takeover. And so they would characterize Cuba, for example, before Castro, as an economic colony of the United States, along with much of South America and a good bit of Africa. Although now China has supplanted the United States as the biggest trading partner of most of the African states, for a long period during the time that Mahmoud Mamdani was growing up, the United States was the dominant economic power in Africa, the main trading partner of Uganda and other countries there. And so they, as Marxists, tended to see this, once again, with admirable consistency, as a confirmation of America as a colonialist imperialist power.
Now, you called your book Intifada on the Hudson, not Islam on the Hudson. Obviously a reference to the Palestinian-Israeli wars over the last 80 years or so. Now, I want to talk about the interesting relationship here between Zohran Mamdani's two religions, Islam and socialism here, because they're not, or communism, they're not obvious allies. In fact, I think that there's a strong tension that may be going unexamined right there. Let me give you two parallels that strike me from the 20th century. 1970s Afghanistan was really a conflict between the very Islamic Mujahideen against a communist Afghan government that brought in the Soviet Union for backup. And then you have a similar parallel around the same line, or the opposite rather, with Yasser Arafat in Palestine, creating this socialist pan-Arab Islamist mentality. Which of the two do you think Zohran really belongs to here? And how do you explain this kind of conflict between his leftism and his Islamism? Because those two things, to me, seem like obvious rivals rather than allies.
They are rivals, but in the old leftist tradition of Chairman Mao, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they both have a common goal, and that is to destroy the United States, to destroy nation states as we know them, and to replace them with a socialist internationalist megastate. Now, a lot of people don't realize it, but Islam is a political system as well as a religion, and it is an internationalist one that recognizes that a Muslim has no allegiance to, or should have no allegiance to the nation state that he may reside in, but only allegiance to the global ummah, the universal community of the Muslims. And likewise, a Marxist would say that it's much less important that you're French or Spanish or Italian or American than that you are a member of the international proletariat. So they both want to establish authoritarian states that are based on a utopian ideal that is enforced by a reign of terror. And I think that creates their great kinship, that the Marxists want to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, and anybody who gets out of line, of course, goes to the gulag. Meanwhile, in Islam, they want to establish the rule of Sharia, which is the perfect law of Allah, and creates the perfect society, and anybody who gets out of line is subjected to a similar kind of reign of terror of stoning, amputation, beheading, what have you. And so that is the deep connection between the two that I think makes them both so appealing to somebody like Zohran Mamdani, who's more or less an open communist. Although he rejects the label itself, he has also spoken openly and unapologetically about seizing the means of production, nationalizing, or at least making housing the province of the government, whichever government may be involved, in this case, the New York municipal government. And these things all coincide nicely with the Twelver Shiite idea of a universal Islamic state, and he is a Twelver.
So his objective might be then to ultimately establish Sharia control of New York City and America by extension. Being consistent with what you're saying, if he truly is Islamic, that would have to be his logical end goal.
Yeah, I think that that's very possible, if not likely. He did not say much about being a Muslim while he was running for mayor until the very end. And since he's been elected, he's been much more openly Muslim than he ever was during the early stages of his campaign or in his earlier campaigns. And I think that is interesting as well as disquieting, because it suggests that he's operating according to Muhammad, the prophet of Islam's famous dictum, war is deceit. And the Twelver Shiite idea, which is famous in the West, but a lot of people don't realize that it's the Shiites who invented it, and that is taqiyya, religious deception for the cause of Islam. And so it seems to me very possible that Mamdani was hiding the depth of his Islamic allegiance, but that it's going to become clearer as time goes by, as it already has since he's been elected. But one of the most disquieting aspects of this, for example, is his saying that he's going to take domestic violence cases away from the police and send in social workers. Now, if you have some angry husband with a gun, sending a social worker is ludicrous, but it is in line with the Islamic idea based on the Quran that a man is perfectly within his rights to beat a woman from whom he fears disobedience. And consequently, the police have no role in it anyway.
So there's many people in the American left who, when they criticize Israel's handling of Gaza, for instance, right now, they're doing so from a classic Marxist oppressor-oppressed paradigm. So Jews in America are the oppressed in their worldview, but Jews in Israel are the oppressor of the Arab minority that they're dealing with in Gaza or the West Bank or wherever. But what you're suggesting is that Mamdani would see it that way, but also there's some fellow Islamic sympathy. Even though he's not an Arab, he is a Muslim, and he would sympathize with these other Muslims. And you're saying those two ideas dovetail in his worldview.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Look, he is a 12er Shiite, as I noted, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is the foremost enemy of Israel in the world today. It finances Hamas, it finances Hezbollah, finances Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other groups that are determined to the Houthis in Yemen. And so behind every major foe of Israel, you find Iran. Now, Iran doesn't hate Israel because they lost land to it or because they have competing economic interests or something like that. Iran hates Israel solely 100% because of Islam, because the Islamic principle is that any land that was once ruled under Islamic law belongs by right to the Muslims forever. And so Israel has no legitimacy on that basis and must be destroyed. And it's clear Zohran Mamdani's refusal to condemn statements like globalize the Intifada, which is basically saying kill Jews anywhere in the world, it stems from his Islamic commitment and his 12er Shiite Islam in particular, which brings him into a kind of ideological kinship with the Iranian mullahs who hate Israel solely because of Islam.
Sure. Now, here we are, approaching a quarter century since the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. And in that time, I mentioned this in the opener, we launched a war on terror abroad, but we seem to have lost it at home. We killed a lot of Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters, but we ended up with their champions in Congress, in Dearborn, Michigan, now New York City. Now, Robert, to me, that looks like a total defeat on that front. For multiple reasons, it's very complex. But the fact that we've ended up further away in that kind of ideological and I would say civilizational struggle as well tells me something that America did not win the war on terror, at least at home. What's your take?
I couldn't agree more. And I'll tell you, the defeat happened 6 days after 9/11. On September 17th, 2001, when George W. Bush went into a mosque in Washington, D.C., and he had Muslim leaders standing behind him, including Jihad Watch of the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations, who just recently said he was happy about the October 7th jihad massacre in Israel, and Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who was at that time the head of the American Muslim Council, extremely influential in Washington, and now he's in prison for financing Al-Qaeda. So that indicates how Bush was taking advice from and consulting with the wrong people at the time. And what did he say in the mosque? Islam is peace. This is not about Islam. And that completely hamstrung our efforts to identify and confront the motivating ideology behind the people who struck us on 9/11 and who are still waging war against us. And you cannot defeat an enemy you don't understand. That was when our defeat was sealed, right there 6 days later.
Yeah, it does seem to me that the only kind of real defense against this Islamism is a confident, muscular Christianity, the kind that's capable of defending Western civilization. That may not literally mean bringing in the winged hussars to save New York City like they did with Vienna. It might. Maybe that would happen. But certainly it means opposing the kind of multiculturalism that the left, Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, and Andrew Cuomo, and Zohran Mamdani all espouse. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, and it involves being honest about Islam's doctrines of warfare, conquest, and subjugation, and the fact that there is no scenario in Islamic law that allows for Muslims and non-Muslims to coexist peacefully as equals in a state where they both have equality of rights. Islam must dominate and not be dominated, said Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. And so at a certain point, we're going to have to confront that one way or the other. And the longer it's put off, the more difficult it will be to confront. And yet, even now, when people are getting disgusted, and you see the reaction after this Afghan alleged refugee shot 2 National Guards members in Washington last week. And President Trump said he was going to halt immigration from third world countries. Yep. That's a start, but it's out of focus because the problem here is not third world. The problem is Islam. And he's palling around with Qatar and Saudi Arabia without recognizing the ideological component that is at play here or making any effort to counter it. And so while he is going farther than any of his predecessors, he's still not coming to the heart of the matter.
You know, closing out here, my fear isn't that Mamdani will succeed. I think it's a Newtonian law that communism can't really work anywhere it's tried, but rather that he'll fail up. You know, we're dealing with somebody who's very, very crafty, and there's nothing like a Democrat who has the ability to rob you and then convince you to vote for him again. And my fear is, Robert, that conservatives will write him off. Oh, he's a communist. People will see the error of their ways and they'll automatically start voting Republican to counter all of this. But of course, since Barack Obama came on scene, that's not how it works. You actually have to show people the truth and the error of the way that they voted when they voted for Mamdani. What do you see is the future of these electoral political issues here with a guy like Mamdani potentially seeking, I don't know, a role in the U.S. Senate, for instance, and spreading more third world Soviet-minded communists like himself throughout the Democratic Party and then by extension into the mainstream of American politics? What do we do to counter that?
Well, we have to do what we're doing here and talking about what he's really all about, and hope that other people will heed and join us in this and start to raise awareness among people of what's at stake here. Because you're absolutely right. This is almost certainly going to be another missed opportunity for the Republican Party, where they're acting like Trotskyites, you know, and Trotsky lost in the Soviet Union in the power struggle to Stalin. And he was in large part because he was complacently sitting around figuring that history would turn things around in his favor because he was on the right side of history. And Republicans are doing that now in New York, as they tend to do everywhere, saying Mamdani's going to fail and it will benefit us. But they have to do the work to make that happen. History doesn't actually work as if it were some railroad following some inevitable track. That is a Marxist notion. And so we have to keep sounding the alarm about what Mamdani is really all about and what he hopes to do, and to try to stop him as he inevitably blames Trump and blames patriots for the failures that he's going to experience. And we have to be ready to explain to people in simple and clear manners exactly why it's really all Mamdani's fault and the fault of his Marxist policies.
Final question as we close out here. Tell us more about Jihad Watch for people who are unfamiliar with your great work and where people can buy your book.
Thanks, Hayden. Yeah, Jihad Watch is a news site about jihad activity. There's no other that I know of, and it is updated many times daily at jihadwatch.org. And the book, Intifada on the Hudson, is available on Amazon. And if there are still bookstores out there, it's probably obtainable through them as well.
I can't recommend it enough. Thank you, Robert Smith, for your time on this and all your great work.
A pleasure, Hayden. Good to talk to you. It's unusual to talk to somebody who has an in-depth knowledge of these issues, and so I much appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
Because I read your book. Thanks again. I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. And until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.